Stan wanted to write things other than comics. Everybody who wrote comics wanted to write things other than comics. They were disposable items. They were not meant to be reprinted. It was an industry where no matter how good you were, you couldn't get that famous, you couldn't get that rich. And Stan was just staying in it because that was the job he had and get a relation to the owner of the company. And it's tough to say, I'm going to turn that aside now. Because he was working so many hours, he couldn't take the time away from comics to write a novel. He was kind of trapped in a certain way.
The thing about Jack was he, kind of fallen on evil times in the 50s. Comics changed. His kind of vitality was no longer really wanted in comics. They became very bland. He ended up at DC and he was doing something like Challengers of the Unknown.
He was doing Challengers of the Unknown and a couple other things over there. DC let him go.
They thought that some of his stylistic works were bad drawing. He had a family to feed. Jack was scurrying around to different publishers trying to find work. There wasn't much.
In the 1950s, there was a big backlash against comics. There was a Senate subcommittee hearing for juvenile delinquency that pointed the finger at comic books. Churches were holding comic book burnings, and sales just kind of bottomed out.
Stan had a midlife crisis for sure. He was already about 40 years old at that point. He realized, I had these dreams. That hasn't happened because I've been here all this time just coasting along. At that time, DC started really coming alive with superheroes with this genius stroke they had of putting their main heroes together in one big group.
The fellow who was then the publisher, he said to me, Stan, I found out that DC Comics has a book called The Justice League, and it's selling pretty well. And maybe we ought to do a book with a lot of superheroes.
And my wife said to me, Stan, if you want to quit anyway, why don't you do one book the way you'd like to do it? The worst that happens is you'll be fired, but so what? You want to quit.
Your back's against the wall. That's absolutely, when you're in crisis, is often when the best ideas come.
I decided I would try to do them a little differently. And I wanted Jack Kirby to do the first one because I felt he was the best there is.
It must have been strange for Jack Kirby to come back and be working for this kid who had been his assistant almost 20 years earlier. But there weren't a lot of options for an artist. He was pretty much forced to come back to Marvel.
At the beginning of the 1960s, the idea that these two guys would be able to create something special that would be remembered in a year, much less decades later, was impossible to fathom.
DC became the establishment in the 50s and really the big corporate comic book publishing company that everybody recognized. Because DC had the Trinity, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, they were already well established 20 years ahead of Marvel Comics.
They had the distribution agreements that got their magazines out into the newsstands. But they also played it as safe as humanly possible. As a result, the stories that came about in the comics were really designed for very young kids.
They were written for 7-year-old kids. There was no thought really of characterization, of personality. So on the first one, which became the Fantastic Four, I was trying to take these comic book characters and treat them as if they were in a book by some famous author, by Charles Dickens, and make them real characters as much as possible in the comic book medium.
Even the villains are people. There is something in their lives that makes them become a problem to others.
They were not like the Justice League over at DC. They had issues, they had problems. I honestly don't believe that they thought it would be successful.
I remember seeing the Fantastic Four on the stands in the summer of '61. So I picked it up, and I really found that it was quite different from the DC comics. The art was more exciting, but the writing was even more strange because the characters were a little more realistic. It took those comic book tropes of heroism and so forth and kind of turned them on their head by having these characters not like each other. Plus, the villain was even sympathetic. This was a tortured guy who could barely see, a rather pitiful creature.
you know, these comic books are really about people who are flawed humans. And I think that Stanley and Jack Kirby really brought those characters, made them very complex from the beginning, and ultimately it resonated with people.
The idea that a team of superheroes would have fights and break up, it just blew my mind. And it's immediately better than the Superman Batman comics I was reading.
Luckily, the book sold, and my publisher said, give me another book, Stan. We're going strong. Let's do some more.